Hey, it's Ashley. This story starts with a simple service. In a city where magic can erase pain, people come to a quiet man named Jake to forget the things they can't live with anymore. But when one woman asks him to remove the memory of a broken love, the spell doesn't disappear the past. It gives it to him. Now he carries a life that was never his, and the only person who could understand it no longer remembers who she used to be. This is a story about stolen memories, second chances, and the strange way love sometimes survives even when the past doesn't. So settle in, because some stories aren't remembered, they're inherited. The rain fell on the cobblestones of the lower city with a rhythm like 1,000 tiny, impatient drums. Inside his garret room, Jake traced the sigil-etched rim of a silver basin, the water within unnaturally still. He was waiting. His trade thrived in desperation, and desperation was always punctual. A knock. 3 short raps, sharp as breaking glass. The door creaked open on a woman whose sorrow had sculpted her face into something exquisite and terrible. Lady Aveline de Valois, though she gave no name, smelled of expensive perfume and salt. She laid a purse heavy with coin on his scarred table. "Make it gone," she whispered, her voice frayed at the edges. "All of it. The Baron, the summer by the sea, the promises. Make it like it never was." Jake nodded, gesturing to the simple wooden chair. He never offered comfort. He was a surgeon of the soul, and his tools were sharp. As she settled, her gaze fell on a single, wilting rose in a vase on his windowsill. "A shame," she murmured, almost to herself. It was so beautiful. He had done it 100 times, 1,000. His fingers, stained faintly silver, danced in the air above her temple, pulling at invisible threads. But this was different. The memory wasn't a simple tapestry to be unpicked. It was a galaxy. He saw sun-drenched afternoons in a meadow of wildflowers, her laughter the only sound. He felt the phantom weight of her head on his shoulder, he thought, with a dizzying jolt, and heard the Baron's voice, not cruel as it was now, but soft, promising a lifetime. He saw her, not this hollowed-out woman, but Aveline, vibrant and fiercely in love. As he wove the spell of forgetting, a snag, an echo, stronger than any he'd encountered. The memory of her joy, her trust, her devastating love, recoiled from the void and latched onto him. The spell shattered. He recoiled, gasping, as Aveline slumped forward, unconscious. The memories were gone from her, true, but they were not gone. They bloomed in his mind, a phantom garden. He looked at her sleeping face and felt a love for a woman who no longer existed, a love that had never been his. He, a man whose own life was a cipher, was now haunted by her happiness. Weeks later, he saw her across a crowded market. She was laughing, a genuine, unburdened sound that twisted something deep in his chest. She was free. He was the prisoner. He found himself drifting toward her, a moth to a flame that had already burned him. "You dropped this," he said, his voice foreign to his own ears, holding out a glove she'd let fall. Their fingers brushed. A spark. Not magic, just a touch. "Thank you," she said, her bright, curious eyes meeting his. There was no recognition, only polite interest. "I'm Aveline." An introduction. A beginning. The name was a key in a lock he didn't know he possessed. "Jake," he replied, the name feeling like a lie on a tongue that now knew the shape of her truest self. He had erased a man from her life only to step, unwelcome and unknowable, into his place. He wanted to tell her everything, that he knew the way she took her tea, that he could recall the specific shade of the sunset on the day she'd fallen in love, that he held the ghost of her happiness inside him. But the words were poison. So he smiled a stranger's smile and said, "A pleasure. The greatest pleasure and the most profound agony of his haunted life." He courted a ghost and she dated a stranger. Their meetings were clandestine, not by her design, but by his terrible necessity. They walked by the river, and he would fight the urge to point out the specific willow tree where the Baron had first kissed her. He'd bite back the story of the lost kitten she'd rescued as a child, a memory he now possessed with the clarity of his own. He was living a lie built on a stolen truth, and the strain was unraveling him. One evening, as they watched a barge drift down the river, she turned to him, her expression serious. "You look at me sometimes," she said, her voice gentle, "as if you're mourning someone you've just met." "Who is it, Jake?" The question hung in the gloaming air, a shard of glass in his throat. He saw the two paths diverging, confession and the certain horror and revulsion that would follow, or silence and the slow, beautiful decay of loving a half-person. "Just a memory," he choked out, the words tasting like ash. "A memory that's not even mine." The confrontation came not from Aveline, but from the past itself. Baron Reynard d'Argent, all swagger and cruel amusement, cornered Jake in a tavern near the docks. "She seems happy," the Baron said, swirling his wine. "Lighter, your work is clean, magician." But she looked at her with that same love-lorn disgust I used to get. "Tell me, did you keep a souvenir? A little morsel for yourself?" Jake's hands curled into fists on the rough wooden table. "My work is done. You have your money." "Ah, but the transaction isn't complete." The Baron smiled, a predator's grin. "I didn't just want her memory erased. I wanted you to understand. I wanted you to carry a piece of it, to know what it is to have something precious that can never be yours. Consider it a bonus." The implication was a physical blow. It wasn't an accident. The echo, the transfer of emotion, was intentional, a cruel, bespoke curse. The Baron had weaponized Aveline's love against them both. Jake looked from the Baron's smug face to the window, where he could just make out the lights and Aveline's family's manor across the city. He was not just a thief of memories. He was a vessel for a man's spite. That night, the garden in his mind became a overgrown jungle. The Baron's words festered, twisting the stolen memories into venomous shapes. He saw every tender glance, every whispered promise, not as Aveline's genuine experience, but as a lie the Baron had fed him. The love he felt for her was tainted, a product of another man's malice. He stood before his silver basin, the water black as pitch. He could try to excise the memories, to carve them out of his own mind, but the process was brutal, often leaving the practitioner a hollowed-out wreck. Or he could walk away, disappear, and leave Aveline to her clean, simple life. But the thought of her, vulnerable and ignorant, prey to any charming monster like Reynard, was worse than any self-inflicted wound. He finally understood. It didn't matter where the feeling came from. What mattered was what it made him want to do now. He filled a small satchel with a few meager belongings and a handful of silver coins, the honest payment from a different client. He had one last thing to steal. He didn't go to her as a lover, but as a witness. He found her in the manor's library, surrounded by books she didn't remember reading. "Aveline," he said, and her name on his lips felt different, heavy with history. "We need to talk." The lightness was gone from her expression, replaced by concern. "Jake, what is it? You're frightening me." He didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He just began to speak. He didn't start with magic or the Baron. He started with the rose by the window. "You once told me it was a shame that it was so beautiful," he said softly. "You told me that the day I met you, even though you don't remember it." He described the meadow of wildflowers, the specific way the Baron's coat smelled of leather and rain, the name she had given to the kitten she saved. He recounted not the grand passion, but the small, unremarkable details that made up a life. Her own life, her face, pale and still, showed the dawning of a horror she couldn't name. It was like hearing a story about a stranger that felt inexplicably like a diary entry written in her own hand. "How?" she finally breathed, the word a puff of air. "How do you know these things?" Jake finally met her gaze, his own eyes swimming with the ghosts of her joy and pain. "Because," he said, his voice breaking, "the Baron didn't just hire me to erase your memories. He paid me to inherit them." The silence in the library was absolute. a heavy tapestry woven from her shock and his confession. Aveline didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply stood, a fragile porcelain doll with a hairline crack running through its very soul, and stared at the man who was both a stranger and the sole keeper of her past. "Inherit them," she repeated, her voice a dry, rasping thing. The words were alien on her tongue. Like a title? Like a piece of land? The absurdity of it was a shield against the terror. "My life, my love, it's property you now hold?" Jake flinched as if she'd struck him. "No, not property. A burden. A cruel joke he played on us both." He took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, remembering himself. "I tried to fight it, Aveline, to be just a man meeting a woman in a market. But I know the cadence of your laugh when you're truly happy. I know the way you fiddle with your locket when you're nervous. I know you, and I don't know you at all, and it is tearing me apart." His raw honesty was more terrifying than any lie. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw it. The sorrow in the lines around his eyes wasn't his own. The love she had sometimes thought she saw directed at her was real, but it was not for her. It was for a memory, for a ghost of herself he carried inside him. "Leave," she whispered, her composure finally shattering. "Get out." Days turned into a week. Aveline did not leave the manor. She moved through the halls like a phantom, her own home now alien. She avoided mirrors, afraid of the face she didn't truly know. Every servant's glance, every friend's cheerful inquiry felt like a lie. Her mind was a locked room, and Jake held the only key. In the depths of her emptiness, a new feeling began to sprout: rage. Not at Jake, the wretched vessel, but at the Baron. He had not just broken her heart, he had stolen her identity, leaving behind a beautiful, empty shell. And for what? So she wouldn't be a nuisance? So he could admire his own brutish cleverness? She found Jake in the gloaming, standing by the river near where they had last spoken. He was thinner, haunted, the shadows clinging to him like a second coat. "You're still here," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth. He turned, and the raw hope in his eyes was painful to witness. "I couldn't leave. Not until—" "Not until what?" she challenged. "Until you decided whether to give me back what's mine." He shook his head, weary beyond his years. "It's not that simple. Mnemonic weaving doesn't have a reverse setting. Pushing them back into you would be like shattering glass in your mind. You might not survive it." The thought was a cold, sharp spike of ice in her veins. She might not survive it. To live forever as this pale imitation, or risk madness for a chance at wholeness? She thought of the Baron, his smug certainty that he had won, that he had contained her pain and her past in a neat little box and buried it. The rage returned, a hot, clean fire burning away the frost of her despair. "Then teach me," she said, the decision solidifying inside her, hard as diamond. Jake stared at her, bewildered. "Teach you?" "Teach me the art," Aveline insisted, her voice gaining strength. "You said it's like weaving. Then teach me to hold the needle. If I can't have my memories back, I will at least learn the nature of my own cage. And maybe," she added, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, unfamiliar light, "I will learn how to build a cage of my own." For the first time, Jake saw not the sorrowful woman from the garret, nor the carefree girl from the market, but a third Aveline. A woman forged in the absence of herself, sharp and resilient and terrifying in her resolve. He saw the echo of her strength, a quality he had not been able to fully appreciate when it was tangled up with the memory of love. He saw a chance at something new, not a restoration of the past, but the creation of a future. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but this is a dangerous path, Aveline. Once you start looking behind the curtain of the mind, you can never unsee what's there." He set up a small basin in a disused storeroom of the manor, the water within a placid, silvery eye. Their lessons began at dusk, in the secret hours. He taught her to quiet the noise of her own thoughts, to listen for the hum of memory that underpinned reality. He showed her the basic sigils, the simple weaves that could smooth the edges of a recent hurt or clarify a faded image. Evelyn was a prodigy. Where he had learned through painstaking trial and error, she learned with a desperate, furious focus. She was not merely learning a skill. She was conducting an archaeological dig on her own soul. One evening, as she practiced on the memory of a spilt glass of wine, she brushed against something else. A flicker. Not her own. It was cold, metallic, and smelled of iron. It was Jake. She pulled back, gasping, her heart hammering. "What was that?" she asked, her eyes wide. Jake looked away, a familiar, weary shame settling on his features. "Just an echo from a client, long ago." He didn't elaborate, and Aveline knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was a man built from other people's tragedies. The thought that she had added her own to that collection filled her with a complex and painful emotion that was neither pity nor love, but something new entirely. The Baron was getting restless. Aveline's continued seclusion was an anomaly, a loose thread in his perfectly tailored narrative of her pathetic recovery. He began sending gifts, then letters, then finally appeared at the manor gates demanding an audience. Aveline, cloaked in a new authority she hadn't possessed a month ago, agreed to see him. He found her not in a parlor, but in the same library where Jake had shattered her world. She sat behind a large oak desk, not as a hostess, but as a judge. "Reynard," she said, her voice cool and level. He faltered, taken aback by her composure. "Aveline, my dear, you've been a recluse. I was worried." "Were you?" she countered, tapping a single manicured finger on the desk. "Or were you simply checking to see if your purchase was still intact?" The words hung in the air. The Baron's charming facade cracked. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Aveline said, rising slowly. She held up her hand, a faint, silvery light coalescing around her fingers, a beginner's weave. "But enough to make her point. You paid a magician to steal my past. But you forgot one thing, Baron. You also left behind a teacher." The horror on Reynard's face was a masterpiece, a portrait of a man who had just seen his victim pick up the knife he'd used to wound her. He saw not a broken heart, but a mind that was learning how to break things back. She let him flee. Watching him scramble from the room, his arrogance crumbling into primal fear, was a victory, but it was a hollow one. The power felt like a costume. That night, she sought out Jake. He was in the storeroom, staring into the basin as if it held an answer. "I saw him," she said, her voice softer now. "The Baron." Jake turned, his expression guarded. "And I showed him a little trick," she admitted. He was terrified. A silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. "Did it feel good?" Jake asked quietly. "Yes," Aveline said. "And no, it was like wielding a sword I don't know how to hold. I'm strong, Jake, but it's a borrowed strength. It's built on the wreckage of a person I used to be, a person I can't even remember." For the first time, she allowed herself to look vulnerable with him, not as a victim, but as an apprentice facing a master. "The memories you hold, the me you know." Was she strong like this? Jake considered it, his gaze distant as he searched the ghost gallery of her past. "No," he said finally. Her strength was softer, resilient, a willow that bends in the storm. You are the storm." The distinction was profound. She was not the woman he loved. She was the woman created by her absence. And in that moment, she made a choice. She wasn't going to be the storm for him. She reached out and, for the second time, touched him. But this was not the accidental brush of a stranger. It was deliberate. "Show me," she whispered, her fingers closing over his. "Show me her. Show me myself." The transfer was not a flood, but a trickle. Jake, weary of carrying the weight alone, let a single memory flow through their joined hands, a conduit of living experience. He chose one that was quiet, unremarkable. He gave her the memory of herself, sitting on a windowsill on a rainy afternoon, reading a book of poetry. She felt the cool glass against her cheek, smelled the scent of old paper and damp earth, heard the soft patter of rain on the roof. She felt a profound, simple contentment, a peacefulness so alien to her current state that it brought tears to her eyes. This was her. This was a piece of her soul. When it was over, she pulled her hand back, gasping. The memory was now hers, nestled in the empty spaces of her mind. It felt like finding a single, perfect seashell on a barren shore. Again, she demanded, her voice fierce with a newfound hunger. So he gave her another, and another. Not the grand passions with the baron, but the small, defining moments. The pride of finally mastering a difficult piece on the pianoforte. The embarrassment of tripping and falling into a fountain as a child. The warmth of her mother's hands on her forehead. Aveline sat there in the dusty storeroom, and she reassembled herself, piece by stolen piece, with Jake as her reluctant, aching guide. He was giving her back her life, and with every piece he surrendered, a part of him hollowed out. He was becoming the empty vessel she once was. Aveline changed. The sharp, brittle edges of her forged strength softened, tempered by the warmth of her own reclaimed past. She walked the halls of the manor not as a ghost, but as its mistress, her movements imbued with a history she now owned. She and Jake no longer met as teacher and student or as victim and perpetrator. They met as archivists. He was the library, and she was the scholar, painstakingly cataloging her own existence. One evening, he brought her the last memory. "There's nothing more," he said, his voice hollow. "The garden is empty." She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The sorrow was no longer an echo, it was his own. A vast, empty space where her life had been. The man who had haunted her was now a ghost himself. "What happens to you?" she asked. The question a gentle balm on a wound she had only just begun to understand. He managed a shrug, a gesture of profound indifference that was more painful than any cry of despair. "I'll find other work. I always do." "No," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She rose and crossed the room to him, taking his face in her hands. She had her memories now. She could access the well of her own love, her own compassion. "You won't." She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of transference, of creation. She poured a memory of her own into him, not a relic of the past he had stolen, but something new. The memory of this moment, of her decision, of her choosing to see him, Jake, not the magician, but the man who had sacrificed himself to give her back herself. The kiss was an anchor in the storm of his emptiness. For a long moment, Jake was adrift in a sea of nothing, and then a single warm light bloomed in the darkness. It was her, not the Aveline of sun-drenched meadows, not the Aveline of tragic romance, but this Aveline. The one who stood before him, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective empathy. The one who was giving him a memory of his own. He pulled back, stunned, touching his lips as if to confirm they were still there. "What did you do?" he breathed. "I started a new collection for you," she said, a small, sad smile gracing her lips. "One that doesn't belong to anyone else." The implications were staggering. He, who had only ever lived through the reflections of other lives, was being given a starting point, a foundation. The depth of her gesture, the sheer, selfless artistry of it, dwarfed all the stolen sorrows he had ever carried. For the first time, he felt something that was undeniably, terrifyingly his own, a profound and overwhelming gratitude that threatened to shatter what little composure he had left. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted, his voice raw. "Then we'll figure it out together," she replied, her hand finding his. A new tapestry will weave it from scratch. The Baron could not let it rest. The image of Evelyn, her hand glowing with forbidden power, had curdled into obsession. He saw her not as a woman he had wronged, but as a loose cannon, a threat to the meticulously constructed order of his world. He gathered whispers, coin, and a new kind of specialist. Not a memory magician, but a mind breaker. A brute who used demonic weaving not to excise but to shatter, leaving behind a compliant, hollowed-out shell. His plan was no longer about Aveline's peace. It was about her pacification. He would hire this thug to erase not her past, but her new power, her defiance, her very self. He would turn the storeroom archivist back into the beautiful, broken puppet he had paid for. Reynard d'Argent, in his lavish study, swirled a brandy and smiled. A mistake could be corrected. A rebellion could be crushed. He would simply purchase a more permanent solution. Evelyn felt the intrusion as a sharp, discordant hum in her mind, like a single, horribly wrong note in a symphony. It was a crude, clumsy probe, a battering ram at the gates of her consciousness. She was in the library, but her mind's eye was in the dusty storeroom with Jake, watching him explain the delicate weave of a containment shield. "It's not a wall," he was saying, "it's a mirror. You don't block the attack, you reflect its nature back onto the source." The humming intensified, a pressure building behind her eyes. Panic flared, hot and bright. She was still a novice. What could she possibly do against a master of this dark art? Then Jake's new memory, her gift to him, surfaced. Not the image of her, but the feeling of being chosen, of being seen. It wasn't a shield of polished silver, it was a shield of purpose. She closed her eyes, gathered the threads of her newfound self, her rage, her reclaimed history, her fierce love for the man who had given it all back, and she wove. She didn't build a mirror, she wove a window, miles away, in a squalid room smelling of cheap incense and fear. The mindbreaker grunted in exertion. He was pushing hard, targeting the noblewoman's core persona, preparing to splinter it. He expected resistance, fear, maybe even pain. He did not expect to suddenly see through her eyes. The library was gone. He was looking at the Baron's study from a vantage point just over Reynard's shoulder. He saw the Baron's self-satisfied smirk, the half-empty glass of brandy. Then, a new perception flooded him. He felt Evelyn's contempt for the man, cold and sharp as ice. He felt her love for Jake, a deep and steady fire. He felt her memories, not as data points to be stolen, but as a living, breathing identity. The mindbreaker screamed, a raw animal sound of psychic agony. He wasn't just being blocked. He was being forced to experience the consequences of his actions. He was being made to feel the soul he was paid to destroy. He severed the connection so violently he pitched forward, smashing his head on the floor, blood mingling with the spilled incense. In the library, the pressure vanished. Evelyn opened her eyes, trembling but whole. She had not just defended herself, she had counterattacked. A giddy, terrifying power surged through her. She ran from the library, not in fear, but with purpose. She found Jake in the garden, staring at a rosebush, the silver light of dawn catching the hollows of his face. "He tried again," she said, her voice tight with adrenaline. "He sent someone. A breaker." Jake spun around, his expression grim. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "No," Aveline said, a wild light in her eyes. "I hurt him. Jake, I think I broke him. I shoot him. Everything." She saw the dawning horror and pride warring on his face. He had given her the keys to the kingdom and she had just declared war. "He won't stop," Jake stated, the certainty in his voice a cold weight. "This has gone from a slight to a threat to his power. He'll come for you himself, with more resources, more men. We can't stay here." You looked around the manicured garden at the manor that was no longer a sanctuary but a target. "We have to run." Running was a simple word, but its reality was a tapestry of impossible threads. Leave her home, her name, her entire existence, for a life on the run with a man whose trade was a capital offense, haunted by a nobleman with a vendetta? Evelyn looked at Jake, at the genuine fear in his eyes for her safety, not for himself. She thought of the Baron, sitting in his study, treating her life and mind as commodities to be bought and sold. To run would be to concede the battlefield. To hide would be to live in the shadow of his power. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We don't run." Jake stared at her, confused. "Evelyn, he's a baron. He has guards, influence, the law on his side." "And I have you," she countered, stepping closer. "And I have this." She held up her hand, the faint, silvery light of her power flickering around her fingertips. "You taught me that weaving isn't just about the mind. It's about perception, about seeing the threads that connect things." Her mind raced, connecting the dots of a desperate, audacious plan. He thinks he's a hunter. Let's show him what it's like to be the prey. The plan was madness. It hinged on a principle Jake had only ever theorized: collective weaving. The idea that multiple practitioners, focusing their will in concert, could create a memory so potent, so real, it could manifest physically, not for one person, but for an entire group. To create a shared hallucination, a phantom born of pure intention. "It's never been done," Jake protested, pacing the confines of the storeroom. "The synchronization required is impossible. One stray thought, one misthreaded emotion, and the whole thing collapses into chaos." "Then we won't be sloppy," Evelyn insisted, her resolve a palpable force in the room. "We'll use his own weapon against him. He wants to control perception? We'll give him a perception he can't escape." She outlined her idea. They wouldn't attack the Baron directly. They would attack his power base, the upcoming solstice ball, the most important social event of the season, held at the governor's palace. They would weave a memory not of violence, but of scandal. A public, undeniable, and utterly humiliating memory of Reynard d'Argent confessing his crimes, his face twisted with the very spite she now knew so well. They worked through the long nights, their minds twined in an intimacy more profound than any physical touch. Jake, the architect, designed the weave's structure, a complex lattice of intent. Aveline, the power source, provided the emotional core, the raw, undiluted fury and righteousness she felt toward the Baron. He taught her to find the resonant frequency of a room, to attune her will to the ambient thoughts of a crowd. It was like tuning an instrument in an orchestra of ghosts. In the quiet moments, when they would break, exhausted, their foreheads pressed together as they shared breath, the stolen memories and the new one she had given him would flutter between them. He still carried the ghost of her old love, and she held the echo of his empty solitude. They were two broken people, using their cracks to let the light in, weaving a future from the wreckage of the past. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one night, his hand resting on her cheek. "If we fail, they'll burn us both." She turned her head and kissed his palm. "Then let's make sure they remember the fire." The night of the solstice ball was a symphony of light and laughter. The governor's palace blazed with 1,000 lanterns, and within its gilded halls, the city's elite glittered like a human constellation. Jake and Aveline moved through the throng like shadows, unnoticed. He was dressed as a minor clerk, she as a companion to a forgettable dowager. They found their position at the edge of the grand ballroom, overlooking the dais where the Baron would soon be honored. Eveline's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the waltz's elegant rhythm. Across the room she saw him, Reynard d'Argent, resplendent in velvet and smugness, holding court. He caught her eye for a fleeting second and offered a small, proprietary smile, as if to remind her that she was still, in his mind, his property. That was all the fuel she needed. She met Jake's gaze, a silent question passing between them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. They closed their eyes, a subtle action lost in the swirl of the crowd. In the privacy of their shared mind, they began the weave. Jake laid the foundation, a vast invisible net cast over the ballroom. Aveline poured her power into it, her focus a white-hot lance aimed at the Baron. She didn't just think of his betrayal. She relived it, channeling the phantom pain of her erased self, the cold shock of her empty mind, the rage of her awakening. She took Jake's hollow emptiness and wove it into the profound loneliness of a man made of other people's sorrows. Together, they did not create a lie. They created a truth, the memory of a confession that had never happened, but one that perfectly, absolutely mirrored the soul of the man who stood smiling on the dais. The conductor raised his baton and the music swelled. At that exact moment, Baron Reynard d'Argent stepped forward to accept the governor's commendation. He opened his mouth to speak the expected words of thanks and feigned humility. But a different sound came out. His own voice, stripped of its charm, laced with the venom of his true nature, echoed through the suddenly silent hall. "I thank you for this honor," it sneered, a sound that sent a chill through every guest. "Though it is little compensation for the tedium of governing you sheep. I find far more amusement in private enterprises, in buying and selling not just goods but souls. Did you know," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the horrified crowd, "that for the right price a man's past can be unmade, that a woman's memories of love are as malleable as clay in my hands? I broke one recently. A lovely creature, erased her very essence just to see the pretty empty shell she'd become. A masterpiece, really. The spell held for 10, 15, 20 seconds. An eternity of frozen horror. The guests stared, their faces pale masks of disbelief. The governor's jaw was slack. Guards shifted uncomfortably, their hands hovering near their swords. Then, as the weave's energy began to fray, the Baron blinked. The venomous speech had stopped. He was standing, smiling, one hand raised to accept the medal he had already been given. He looked around, confused by the deathly silence, the gaping mouths. "Is something amiss?" he asked, his perfectly normal, charming voice utterly at odds with the memory now branded onto 300 minds. The dissonance was absolute. People didn't just think they had heard it. They remembered hearing it. They remembered the curl of his lip, the cruel glint in his eye. He had not been framed, he had been exposed. Panic was a contagion. A noblewoman fainted with a gasp. A man in the back whispered, "Sorcery." Another shouted, "He admitted it." The carefully constructed social order of the ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces. Reynard d'Argent, for the first time in his life, looked truly afraid. He saw the accusation in their eyes, not suspicion but the rock-solid certainty of a shared, impossible experience. He scanned the crowd, his mind racing for an explanation, for a scapegoat. Then he saw her. Aveline, standing near the back, was not watching the chaos. She was watching him. And on her face was not triumph, but a deep, profound sorrow for the soul he had proven himself to be. In that moment, he knew. It wasn't magic from some rival. It was her. The broken thing he had made, returning to haunt him. The Baron's guards, loyal to coin but not to a monster, hesitated. That was all the opening the crowd needed. It wasn't a mob, not yet. It was a recoiling. People stepped back from him, creating a wide, empty circle on the floor around the dais, as if he were plague-ridden. The governor, a politician to his core, finally found his voice. "Baron d'Argent," he boomed, his face grim with the weight of 300 witnesses he could not afford to disbelieve. "You will accompany the guard to the citadel. We will have words." The words were a formality. The sentence had already been passed in the silent courtroom of collective memory. Reynard was surrounded, his face ashen. As he was being led away, his eyes found Aveline one last time. There was no more smugness, no more spite. Only a dawning, terrified comprehension. He had tried to control the story, and she had become the author. Aveline felt Jake's hand on her arm, a steady, grounding pressure. "It's done," he murmured, his voice strained with exhaustion. The weave had drained them both. "We need to go. Now." He was right. Their magic was a temporary miracle. Soon, questions would be asked. Whispers of sorcery would become accusations. They were not heroes. They were pariahs who had used forbidden power. She let him guide her from the hall. They retreat lost in the spectacle of a fallen baron's exit. They melted into the cool night air, leaving behind the gilded cage and the ghost of a borrowed war. They walked for a long time, the city waking up around them, carrying rumors of impossible things. They didn't speak. They just walked, two solitary figures against the dawn, their hands clasped together, a quiet anchor in the wreckage they had made. They found a small, rented room above a baker's shop in a part of the city where no one would think to look for a disgraced noblewoman. The air smelled of yeast and cinnamon, a smell so profoundly, simply normal that Aveline wanted to weep. They were fugitives with a single coin between them, but they were free. Jake sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his head in his hands. He had given her everything, and in doing so, had become as empty as she once was. Aveline knelt before him, gently taking his hands from his face. His eyes were haunted, not by her past anymore, but by the vast, terrifying vacuum of his own present. "You told me once," she said softly, "that you would start a new collection." She pressed her palm to his cheek, weaving a simple, gentle thread of calm. "Then let's start it now. Our first memory. This room. This smell. This silence. Us." The days that followed were a quiet miracle. They survived on odd jobs. Jake using a subtle weave of suggestion to help a merchant find a lost ledger. Aveline using her new empathetic sensitivity to counsel a grieving couple through a misunderstanding. They used their talents not for grand revenge, but for small, necessary mends. In the evenings, they would sit by the window and Aveline would give Jake memories. Not her grand passions or tragedies, but the simple textures of a life. The feeling of grass under bare feet, the taste of her mother's honey cakes, the pride of learning to write her own name. He was no longer a vessel for stolen sorrow, but a museum she was curating for him, exhibit by exhibit. One evening, as a summer rain washed the streets below, he looked at her, and for the first time she saw not gratitude or obligation, but something else, something new. He was no longer just remembering her life. He was living his. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the kiss of transference, nor the kiss of a desperate bargain. It was simple. It was present. It was his. Aveline felt it not as a memory being given, but as one being created right there in the humid, rain-scented air. It was a clumsy, hopeful kiss, the kiss of two people who had forgotten how to be ordinary and were learning how to be extraordinary together. When they parted, he looked at her, a shy smile touching his lips. "I think," he said, his voice full of a wonder she was just beginning to understand, "that was mine." Aveline laughed, a real, unburdened sound, and in that small, rented room, they began to weave a new tapestry. It was not a grand epic of love and loss, but a quiet story of a baker's shop, a summer rain, and two people who had stolen a future from the wreckage of the past. The threads were theirs, and theirs alone, to weave. That was the man who stole her yesterday. Thank you for listening and spending this time with me. Stories like this only really exist once someone hears them. So if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. It helps these stories find the people who might need them. There are more worlds coming, more strange magic, more stories about the things we lose and the things we rebuild. So stay tuned. And until next time, thank you for being here.